Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see so many folks in the room. And I understand that we have almost 200 people joining us online from 18 countries. So, bear with us as we go through our translation issues, but we will certainly get there. And I can't tell you enough how excited I am about today, what today represents, what it represents for JANM, and what it represents for Discover Nikkei. It's the kickoff of our 20th anniversary of Discover Nikkei. 20 years of consistent and exciting and innovative programming that has connected the Japanese diaspora across the world. It's been this extraordinary platform that we've run from JANM that's unearthed amazing stories about Japanese migrants, about family stories, the stories about descendants across the world, culture, food, amazing family stories, and this really deep international community that's been built that carries forward and carries across the globe this cultural diversity, and that continues to explore the blending of local and global identities. And of course, the important thing too is that it connects people across generations. The other thing about Discover Nikkei, there are many exciting things about it, but we recently relaunched our entirely new branded site. Of course, we will retain all of the rich content that we've had all over the years, and what makes that content so extraordinary is that almost all of it is content that is driven and created by users. So we have editors all over the world, we have writers, we have contributors all over the world, and then of course we have an amazing sort of home team at JANM that holds it all together. And I will introduce you at the end of my remarks. I'll introduce you to Yoko, who has sort of held this all together from the very beginning. So it's been such a powerful platform for us to be able to make those connections, to understand the Nikkei experience locally, to connect the Nikkei experience locally, nationally, internationally. And then this year is, as I said, the 20th anniversary of that. And we're extraordinarily fortunate to have an amazing team at JANM that has created this, that's kept us going, that's been able to almost completely revolutionize, transform the, totally transform our website and also transform the experience of the users. But this would not have been possible had it not been for the amazing support that we got from the Nippon Foundation. Through a very, very generous endowment, we've been able to fund this program year on year on year. So, on behalf of all of us here, on behalf of JANM, we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Nippon Foundation, because without that support, without that generation, that generous support, we wouldn't have been able to have enjoyed this 20 years of building this deep community across the globe. Our festival today, our Discover Nikkei Fest, it sounds as though some of you have joined us from earlier today. It's been a wonderfully fun day. We've had a lot of family activities, we've had food, we've had experiences, we'll have more as the day progresses. But it is also, we've had some very good workshops. We've had workshops on genealogy, we've had workshops on family storytelling. So it's been a wonderful day to connect all of the different pieces of the culture. And then a big thank you to our festival sponsors, and those include obviously the Nippon Foundation, the Port of Long Beach and Orion, and the very, very generous support of Akira and Hisako, Nerio, Imamura family. And it's with their support that we've been able to bring our panelists from all over the world. So we're tremendously, tremendously excited. And, great thank you to our very faithful media sponsor, the Rafu Shimpo, and of course all of our in-kind donors that have helped to make this day special with donations of all sorts of different kinds of products. So we've got Yakult, Morinaga, Aquamar, Orion Breweries, Daily Foods, Ito in North America, Bandai Namco, and King's Hawaiian. And I hope that I haven't left anybody out. So, as many of you know, we've closed our galleries to the public for a very big renovation project, and to redo our permanent exhibition, which will tell the story of the Japanese-American story from immigration to the present, and also make those deep connections that the Japanese-American community enjoys with communities all over the country and all over the world. So our program today is actually, I think it's our first major event that we've had since we closed the our pavilions, and it's part of our programming that we're calling Janam on the Go, where we'll bring the museum to communities wherever you are, not just in California, not just in the US, but as folks in those 18 countries know, this is part of our programming and our commitment to bring Janam to where all of you are. So please take a moment to check out janam.org on the go so that you can see where those programs are coming to you and what programs we will be having at Janam, and most of the programs that we'll have in the coming months will be here. So I hope to see all of you on the go. Those in person on the go, those online. I hope you'll connect with our programming. We'll have a lot of online programming as well. And now it's such an honor for me to introduce to you Yoko Nishimura, who is Discover Nikkei's project manager. And Yoko is one of those people, she is the person that has helped this together, that's held this together over all of these years, at times with really a skeleton team. Because there was a skeleton team, she built this extraordinary cohort of volunteers, actually from all over the world, that have helped to get this going. And we have several of the Yoko team. We have several of the Yoko Discover Nikkei team here, and I don't know if you can see them, but our staff, I wonder if you could put your hands up. Where are you? So we've got content creators, we've got web developers, we've got writers, we've got editors, we've got illustrators. So it's this amazing team. And then for all of you who volunteered, given of your time to Discover Nikkei, and those folks who are online, who've volunteered to make this such an amazing, vibrant site, thank you to all. But none of this would have happened without Yoko. So Yoko, it's my real privilege to bring you up. Come on.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming here today to celebrate our 20th anniversary. I'm so glad that our project continued to 20 years. And my name is Yoko Nishimura, project manager for the Discover Nikkei project. And the Discover Nikkei project is, and of course, the museum's project, and it's a community-based international network that shares the story of Nikkei, the people of Japanese descent who have migrated and settled around the world. So our sincere thanks to the Nippon Foundation for the generous support of the museum and the Discover Nikkei. And then also, especially, I would like to thank you to the Akira and the Hisako, Nerio, Imamura and family, because of we don't have you guys, and then we cannot have this panel discussion in person. So I really appreciate it. And so before we start the panel discussion, I know you wanted to hear everybody's story, but before that, I would like to a little bit introduce the project, our project Discover Nikkei. So launched in March 2005, Discover Nikkei celebrates cultural diversity and explore global and local identity. The site is available in 4 languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Japanese. And the top country accessing our site are the United States, of course, and then Japanese, Brazil, Peru, and Canada. By sharing Nikkei story from around the world, Discover Nikkei connect generation and then communities. We were thrilled to celebrate Discover Nikkei's 20th anniversary this year. Over the past 20 years, Discover Nikkei, we are offered a wide variety of story from the diverse group of the contributors and sharing a rich variety of viewpoint through journal article and the live history interview and then public program like this. So we are also plan to host more program throughout the year. So we hope you will join us later on. And we have been rolling out the update that will ensure that our platform remains a vital resource for sharing and preserving Nikkei stories while connecting our global Nikkei communities. Also, we recently released the Nikkei album with a new design. So where users can actually post their own photos and videos. We will soon be launching a Nikkei organizations directory where organizations can create their own pages and post their announcement and event information, press release and job opportunity and those and more. So we can we continue to implement the new features to strengthen our international community and increase the connection between Nikkei worldwide in this coming year. So we encourage you to also sign up our email newsletter and as well as also follow us on the social media. So that we can send you the update of our the project. I think I forgot to do it. Okay, so. And the Discover Nikkei Fest is a kickoff of our year-long 20th anniversary celebration. This event showcases various aspects of Discover Nikkei's broader work. The community fair outside of this plaza, and community fair brings together organizations and communities. Just like our new site and the new organization directory are designed to do so. Our family story workshop, I hope some of them also participated in it, and also this today's panel discussion encourage people to share their story in different ways. So we invite you to share your story with us by submitting a journal articles or posting your photos and videos. Finally, our reception after this discussion will be a celebration of community. So offering a space to reflect, come together, and build relationships. So also, we are excited to announce, wait, I'm sorry, I'm kind of behind the slide, sorry. So we are also excited to announce that today we launched our 20 for 20 campaign to help us share stories and build strong global Nikkei communities ties for the next 20 years. So now I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion. In addition to all of you here with us in the Tateuchi Democracy Forum, the program is also being live streamed via Zoom. So we have participating joining us from the world, as I mentioned a little bit. And so from the registration from Brazil, Peru, Canada, Australia, Argentina, even Cuba, Hong Kong, Puerto Rico, and so many places. So now, please allow to introduce Naomi Hirahara, today's moderator. Naomi is an Edgar Award-winning author of multiple mystery series and noir short stories, best known for her historical mysteries, Kraken Division and Evergreen. A long-time Discover Nikkei contributor and a former journalist with the Lafu Shimpo, she has written many non-fiction history books, including the award-winning Terminal Island, Lost Community on America's Edge, and the curated exhibition. Her next Japantown mystery, set in 1903 Pasadena, California, will be released on February 2026. Naomi, thank you so much for your dedication to our community and for hosting this panel discussion today. Thank you. And then I will click here.
Thank you, Yoko. Mensore. Yokoso. Benvido. Bienvenidos. With the simultaneous translation, some of you may have heard me say, welcome, 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 welcome. But welcome to today's panel discussion on sharing International NikkeI Family Stories. We have an incredible lineup of Nikkei thinkers and artists from around the world today. Andrew Hasegawa, Mitch Homma, Gus Hokama, Harumi López Higa, and Jorge Okubaro to share their work researching, interpreting, and sharing their own family stories. And I know you all have them. To all our panelists, we are so excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. We will begin today with each panelist sharing a bit about their background and their own connection to Nikkei Family Stories. Then we'll move into this moderated discussion, and finally, we'll open up the floor to some questions. So have them in mind. And for those of you joining us on the Zoom today, we will also be taking questions from the Zoom chat. And so you could post your questions in the chat anytime through the program, and we'll have a couple times where we will answer your questions. So now I'd like to begin our panel with our first presenter, Andrew Hasegawa. Andrew Hasegawa is a fourth-generation Nikkei Australian. I bet you didn't know that a Nikkei Australian existed. Andrew researches Nikkei history while running a Japanese lifestyle goods business. He's a member of Nikkei Australia. It's a great social media account, by the way, so check it out. And a 2023 Past Wrongs, Past Future Choices Scholar in Residence for his research on the Nikkei fight for freedom from incarceration in Australia and the United States. So now we have Andrew Hasegawa.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Naomi. I'll just move through to the next slide. So first, a quick thank you to Discover Nikkei. It was an unexpected honor to be invited to come to the United States and speak. I'm delighted. So just let me get my thing. So I'm going to start off by contextualizing the Japanese-Australian immigrant experience. The first recorded immigrant from Japan to Australia was in 1873. The person and his son, I'm not sure if it's his adopted son, his biological son, or a protege, was Sakuragawa. And the protege or adopted son was Togawa. They arrived in 1873. After that, there was a steady stream of Japanese immigrants. It started to accelerate in the 1880s when the pearl diving industry started to blossom. Many of the divers came from Japan, in particular Wakayama. They're not diving for pearls, they're diving for mother of pearl, which is often used to make buttons. It's not just pearl divers. There are many Japanese immigrants working in northern Australia in the cane fields. They're labourers. There's also a blossoming business community in Sydney working for trading companies, and they're facilitating the export of Australian wool back to Japan. It was big business. Japan was the third biggest market. There were also many other exceptions. For example, my great-grandfather, he headed south, which was an unusual outcome. He came in search of education. He wanted to improve his English language skills. I'm going to move through and we're going to start talking about my great-grandfather. But before that, I want to make mention that on the 1st of January 1901, Australia federated and became a nation state. It had implications for civilian immigration to Australia, as the same year the Immigration Restriction Act was passed, December 23rd, 1901. Its purpose was to keep Australia white and British to its boot heels. it effectively almost stopped completely immigration from Japan. Now, the pearl divers could come in under exemption. They had no right of long-term residence, and they continued to arrive and work, particularly in Northern Australia, in the city of Broome and also Thursday Island. Now, in the case of Setsutaro Hasegawa, my great-grandfather, his birth was registered in Otaru, Hokkaido, in 1871. It only became a village in 1865. His father was a former samurai, and like many unemployed samurai, he joined the Hokkaido Development Commission and was working in Otaru. His wife, Matsu Koike, was from Tokyo, and I suspect my great-grandfather spent a lot of time with his mother's relatives, where it's most likely he was educated. We can understand that he was well educated by virtue of the fact I can look at his calligraphy on a diary, and it's beautiful. You don't learn that through birth. It's through practice. He came to Australia wanting to learn English, but before he came to Australia, he was a teacher working in the Kansai region. There is, in fact, a membership card of a educational organisation based in Kyoto that he was a member of. We don't know much more than that. Anyway, he came to Australia, probably intending to return home. He was, after all, the eldest son, and it would have been a very high expectation that he would look after his parents in their old age. His father passed in 1907, and I suspect there was enormous pressure on him to return to Australia. So why didn't he return? Because he married and started a family. He had 3 sons, my great-grandfather being the eldest of the 3 sons. And as it turns out, he never returned to Japan. His mother and Japanese family cut him off probably around 1912 because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. And eventually he started running laundries. In fact, he ran laundries where he was the proprietor from around 1901. Prior to that, he'd worked for a wealthy Melbourne family. He didn't stay with them very long because they underpaid the employees, many of whom were Japanese, and confiscated passports. Well, he managed to retrieve his passport because it currently resides in an installation at the Immigration Museum in Melbourne. So what can I say after he started to operate laundries is that he found himself a single parent probably around 1914. His wife left him and left him with 3 sons. The youngest son would have been 3 or 4 years of age. It must have been a very difficult time. So I can see from the archival record that he went and lived with his friend, a tailor, in Melbourne, and then later he went to the city of Geelong, where he had previously lived. And again, he lived with an old friend. Now, at some point, he set up his own laundry, and when I look at the chronological order of events, around the mid-1920s, he suddenly seems to have a lot of money. He bought a house. He bought the freehold to a business in a central location in Geelong. He owned a car. He sent the youngest son to a very exclusive private school in the city of Geelong. So where did the money come from? You don't become wealthy being a laundryman. He was the eldest son. The laws of primogeniture prevailed in Japan right up until just after the end of the Pacific War, when the Americans put a stop to it. So I think he had claimed his inheritance. And as one of my aunts says, one of my father's siblings, she says it was the good times. But the good times didn't last. I'll talk about this a little bit later. So, just like here in the United States, civilian Japanese were rounded up and arrested. They'd had to register as aliens after Australia declared war on Germany. All aliens had to register. That meant that on the day of Pearl Harbor, about 90% of civilian Japanese were arrested and interned. Very few escaped being interned. The people who weren't interned tended to be mixed race Australian Japanese. So he found himself in the Tatura internment camp, which is in northern Victoria. It was a family camp. It had women, it had children, and it was also where the Victorian Japanese, very small community, was sent. He was fortunate that he was released early after about 18 months internment, because at that point in time he was about 72 years of age and not in wonderful health, and he returned home and was subject to house arrest. Now let me just finish up before I show you some photographs, is that at the end of the war, about 85% of those who had been interned were deported. A small rump were allowed to stay because they had strong familial connections with Australia, perhaps children who were considered to be British subjects. You'd think after the war ended, things became easier for Japanese Australians, but that's not the case. The return of prisoners of war from the prisoner of war camps in Southeast Asia caused a general hatred of the Japanese. It was a really difficult time. A lot of Japanese, including two of my grandfather's brothers, changed their names to avoid some of the hostility. I won't keep talking about that. I'd rather field questions. I'm going to show you some photographs and speak just very briefly because I think I'm now over time. This is Setsutaro Hasegawa on a visit to the doctor in his twilight years, always impeccably dressed. There's a diary. You can see his beautiful hand in Japanese. There's a photograph, I think it dates 1909. So on the left, the young boy, that's Leo Takeshi, and the one on the other side is Moto Hasegawa. The exquisitely dressed young man is Setsutaro Hasegawa and his wife Ada. That's a photograph from home, and the second from the left is Matsu Hasegawa, his mother. This is an archival document where he applied to naturalise as a British subject, and it's rejected because he's Asian. Now here is a photograph. The photographer is George Taro Furuya. The car belongs to Setsutaro, and the Japanese man on the left is Motoshiro Ito. His wife is standing next to my great-grandmother, and the woman on the far right is George Taro Furuya's wife. The photograph dates April 1930. He passed his time gardening, breeding goldfish and birds. That photograph doesn't just do justice to the beauty of that garden. There's my grandfather, great-grandfather, and my uncle being nursed by Setsutaro, and my aunt Matsu. An alien registration card issued early in 1940. The registration of aliens meant that when the Japanese were declared enemy aliens, the roundup was easy because they had to register at the police station. And finally, his life came to an end October 4th, 1952, just short of his 82nd birthday. He's buried in Melbourne in the Botanical Cemetery, and I think one day I should visit during Obon and make some sort of celebration. I'll stop there because I've gone 2 minutes over, having said I would speak less rather than more.
So now we have is Mitch Homma. And some of you might be familiar with Mitch already, but he's a third-generation Japanese-American aerospace engineer with interests in Japanese history and Christianity in Japan. A regular Discover Nikkei contributor from its very beginning, he has shared pre-war and World War II family photos, documents, and stories from Japan and the Heart Mountain and Amachi concentration camps. Mitch?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Again, I'm Mitch Homma, and I grew up not too far from here in Torrance, Redondo Beach. Grew up in a very large Asian community. Did American sports, baseball, volleyball, did Asian martial arts, lots of martial arts tournaments all over the nation. Dad worked for Japan Airlines, which meant great Japanese community picnics and lots of great food. And I had the benefit of growing up in my great-grandparents' Baptist churches here in Gardena and Seattle. And I always grew up hearing a lot of family stories from Japan and the US from visiting pastors and other church members. And so, but to me, they were just stories because I didn't have any concrete evidence behind that or anything. And as it was mentioned earlier, my relationship with the Discover Nikkei project started 20 years ago when they were just starting up. And just before Discover Nikkei started in 2004, my grandmother passed away in Seattle, Washington. And she left us 25 boxes of treasure in her closet. And these happened to be photos, documents, artifacts, dishware, going back to the early 1900s. Church photos and their whole ministry in Japan. So all of a sudden, I was able to put my whole family history together and start matching stuff. And when I started talking to Janum here, Sojin Kim and Allison Nakamoto, and I know Emily Anderson's here somewhere, encouraged me to support Discover Nikkei because I had a lot of unique photos and artifacts that would help launch Discover Nikkei into what it is now. I guess I'll go. And so just here, everyone loves having family photos, and so I had family photos going all the way back to the center photos there. My great-grandparents and the little kids there are my grandmother and her younger brother there, and of course the Christian photos, and I'll get into that more later. But what stunned me were, we found her arrest warrants, my great-grandparents' arrest warrants, even great-grandmother. Great-grandmother was one of the few Issei women that were arrested by the FBI and taken to federal detention. And that started, lots of family conversations, because of course, like a lot of families, my family never talked about the World War II years growing up. And I'll share a little bit about why I never pushed my dad very hard on that coming up. But this started launching my curiosity in connecting the dots with my family history and stuff, because all of a sudden, all these church stories I heard and all these inquiries of what happened to my great-grandparents after they were arrested started to sync up and come together. And this is probably the World War II years album is probably one of my most popular albums out there. And we did use that album extensively when Amachi was going for national park status. We referred to that quite a bit. And so what all these artifacts did for me, I could trace my whole family's World War II years in federal detention because I had all their letters from Seagoville and Lordsburg and Santa Fe. And of course, the wood block there is Psalm 121, which great-grandfather did in Santa Fe Detention Center, and it was a part of the Sutra and Bible exhibit here at Janum. And I was able to track and learn a lot about my great-grandmother's experience in Seagoville Detention Center. And of course, they eventually made their way to Amachi, and that's my grandfather there in the dental photo. He was a dentist here in Southern California, not too far from here, and had a lot of movie stars as patients and stuff, and he was a dentist there at Amachi. And how I ended up with my vast collection of Amachi photos, grandfather snuck his cameras into Amachi as dental equipment. So I have a great collection of photos of the early days of Amachi, when photography was still banned and prohibited. And of course, the lasting legacy, the memorial photo there, great-grandfather designed the Amachi Memorial, and the wood planks there are here at Janum. And my grandmother and great-grandfather are in that photo. And so it was great just connecting the different layers of my history and having photographs and actual documents to help piece the stories together, and even strange stories, which I never believed growing up. And so the one photo there is my grandfather in 1917 when he came to the US to go to school and learn how to be a dentist. And he took the photo there, the center photo there of the children. The center one there is my father and my father's older sister and younger brother. And he planted the 2 trees outside their barracks at Amachi there. And so that's a picture of the little tree right after it was transplanted from the Arkansas River Valley and planted there. And in the 2008 Amachi visit during the Janum Enduring Communities Conference, that was the first time my dad and the 2 kids returned to Amachi to visit. So 63 years later then. And we realized there in these photos, that tree that's behind the 3 little kids in the center is still alive and growing out there at Amachi. And of course, it was mentioned, I grew up in their churches and heard a ton of stories about the family starting churches in Japan and the congregations and great-grandmother's famous Sunday schools, which turned into real schools because the government would take them over when they became so popular. And the stories from the American Baptist missionaries, and so all of a sudden I had photographs again to go with the stories I grew up with and stuff. And just the ministry and, the baptism photo there in the top row center, I grew up here and you're baptized in churches or sometimes out at the beach, and realized all these stories I heard about the Buddhists not letting the Christians build churches and them having to have service out in the hillsides and stuff like that. So I have a tremendous collection of fairly early Christianity in Japan and the churches the family started. And of course, some of my other albums, when I figured out how to use Discover Nikkei and stuff, my uncle Mike Wada from Heart Mountain left us a tremendous collection of photographs. And of course, the collection of photos from Gardena Valley Baptist Church, not too far from here, from like 1928 to 1940, has made a lot of connections and reconnected with a lot of family friends through that. And a little different aspect of how I use Discover Nikkei in the color photo there, we used it on my May 2011 tsunami short-term missions relief trip after the tsunami in Japan, where we used it to show the following mission teams going over there, what it was like and the gear they needed to bring. So it turned into almost a real-time mission planning tool where you could show them collections of photos and, again, different ways to connect communities and bring things together, and just trying to get the follow-up teams going over to Japan more prepared than we were going over. We were kind of the discovery team going over. And of course, connecting with Discover Nikkei, I kind of branched over, a high-level overview of a lot of different threads, but the big color family photo there. So when my grandfather became a Christian in Japan in like 1905, he was kicked out of his family. And that side of the family never had any contact with the Wada family in Sendai again. In fact, when my great-grandfather's parents died, he was not allowed to go to their funerals in Japan and stuff. And so In 2008, we were able to connect with the Wada family in Japan, and I was able to share a lot of photos with them through Discover Nikkei. You know, and of course, the photo of the iconic Homma chair there, that also lives here at Janum. There's a wonderful story out there on Discover Nikkei about it. And another rewarding aspect is sharing all these artifacts I had with researchers in Japan. So that's, I had the great privilege to go to Kanto Gakuen University, which was the old Yokohama Baptist seminary, and share a lot of the old Japan Christian photos I had and stuff. And that was just truly rewarding to connect the dots that way. And of course, I mentioned the Homma chair and the stories out there and the links out there. It's my uncle in Heart Mountain the chair is one of 6 surviving chairs, and its permanent home is now here at Janum. And this story is another wonderful story of Discover Nikkei. So the little girl there is playing on my grandmother's piano in Garden Grove. And Alice Takimoto there's mother was arrested the same day as my great-grandmother. And Alice's mother was released from Terminal Island Detention Center, and my great-grandmother was sent to Seagoville, Texas. And the two families who were best friends, best families before World War II, after the war and release, they were never in contact again. And we met Alice at the Janum event in Denver, and the families have reconnected and shared lots of stories. And my great-grandmother was one of Alice Takimoto's idols growing up, so she was relieved to finally figure out what happened to her idol after she was arrested. And that also goes to, you know, the tragedy of the incarceration in forced detention. You know, you had families, best friends that broke up and never ever saw each other again or knew what happened to each other. And again, this is just me as I wrap up there at Amachi in front of the tree great-grandfather planted. And it's just some of the artifacts. And my recent connection, so I love this photo because it's a lot of the American Baptist missionaries in Japan. But I've probably connected with descendants from at least 7 or 8 of those families there, and learned the other side of the connecting the stories, you know, from the American Baptist missionary point of view and stuff like that. And that's a high-level overview of what I had and how I use Discover Nikkei and the wonderful tool it's become. Thank you.
That was fascinating. How many of you have gone to Australia? Raise your hands. Oh, I haven't. And then on the Zoom, you could put it in the chat. So thank you so much, Andrew. Now we have Gus Hokama. Gus Hokama is an award-winning Argentine singer-songwriter of Japanese ancestry. Gus connects his cultural heritage with music and brings it to international stages. Inspired by his grandparents' immigrations from Okinawa, and you're going to hear a lot about Okinawa, to Argentina and his family history, his compositions are an homage to their arduous path of struggle and sacrifice. And last night, we also discovered that Gus also works as a medical examiner, so he's multifaceted. So, Gus.
Bueno, yo nací en Buenos Aires, ¿no? Y fui criado tanto por mis padres como mis abuelos.
I was born in Buenos Aires and raised by my parents and grandparents.
Mis abuelos emigraron de Okinawa a Argentina antes de la Segunda Guerra Mundial.
My grandparents emigrated from Okinawa before World War II.
Su idea inicial era ganar dinero en Argentina para poder después volver a Okinawa para poder ayudar a los familiares que habían quedado allá, ¿no?
Their initial plan was to save money and return to Okinawa to support their family.
Pero al comenzar la Segunda Guerra Mundial, obviamente la idea de volver a Okinawa se desvaneció, ¿no?
But when the war started, obviously they weren't able to go back to Okinawa.
Mis abuelos en Argentina se dedicaron al cultivo de flores, especialmente de claveles.
My grandparents in Argentina dedicated themselves to cultivating flowers, especially carnations.
Al principio ellos alquilaban la tierra donde cultivaban y luego a partir del sacrificio y el trabajo pudieron comprar un terreno.
So initially they rented land for farming, but after hard work and sacrifice, they were able to buy their own plot of land.
Ellos se las arreglaban como podían, ¿no? Obviamente, desde la construcción de su propia casa y de los invernáculos o invernaderos, que era donde cultivaban sus flores.
So they basically did everything themselves. They built their own house and they built the greenhouses where they grew the flowers as well.
Hay una anécdota de mi abuelo que contaba siempre que antiguamente los invernaderos se hacían de vidrio, ¿no?
There was a story my grandfather always told about how back in the old days they built the greenhouses out of glass instead of out of plastic.
Y eso hacía que cuando llovía y caía granizo, el granizo hacía que rompa el techo del vernáculo, ¿no?
So when it would rain really hard or when it would hail, the glass roofs actually shattered and the crops would be damaged.
Entonces al día siguiente la familia y los hijos también de mis abuelos debían recoger los pedacitos de vidrio que caían sobre la tierra.
So the next day, the whole family would have to go out and pick up the shards of glass, and then they would start all over again.
Pero bueno, gracias al esfuerzo de mis abuelos, ellos pudieron pagarle los estudios a sus hijos, de los cuales, de los 4 hijos, 3 se dedicaron al área de salud y el hijo mayor siguió el oficio de las flores, ¿no? Como mis abuelos.
So thanks to the hard work of my grandparents, they were able to pay for their children's education. So 3 of their children worked in the medical field, and the oldest one continued the family trade of flower farming.
En cuanto a mí, yo fui a un colegio primario bilingüe donde se enseñaba Nihongo, japonés y español, ¿no? Ahí la mayoría éramos Nikkei y yo creo que fui criado casi como un argentino.
I grew up attending a bilingual school which spoke Nihongo and Spanish. Most of the students were Nikkei, but at home I felt like I was raised more Argentine.
Había costumbres, como por ejemplo, que habían quedado, ¿no? Como poner el senko en el butsudan o ocasionalmente comer comida japonesa, ¿no?
We did have some Japanese traditions like lighting senko on the butsudan or from time to time eating Japanese food.
Mis abuelos, entre ellos, hablaban en el idioma okinawense, el uchinaguchi.
Between themselves, my grandparents would speak Uchinaguchi, the Okinawan language.
Entre ellos y también entre toda la generación que emigró hacia Argentina, ¿no?
And between them and also between that whole generation that came to Argentina from Okinawa.
Yo obviamente no entendía el idioma, pero mi padre, que fue criado por mis abuelos, sí entiende y hasta puede hablar algunas palabras, ¿no? En Uchinaguchi.
Obviously, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but my father did grow up hearing some of that language, so he could understand a bit and speak Uchinaguchi.
Durante la secundaria sí fui a un colegio católico, en donde en todo el colegio éramos como 1.500 alumnos, yo era el único con rasgos orientales, ¿no?
In high school, I went to a Catholic school where I was the only person with Japanese roots surrounded by Argentine classmates.
Quizás ahí me sentía un poco incómodo, ¿no? Pero después, al comenzar la facultad de medicina y posteriormente cuando egresé, esa incomodidad, entre comillas, ¿no? Se transformó en algo positivo.
Initially, this made me a bit uncomfortable, but as I grew up and when I started studying medicine, I started to realize that being Nikkei was actually a positive thing.
Por lo menos en mi área, ¿no? En el área de salud, La imagen del japonés es la que es estudioso, meticuloso, trabajador.
At least in the area of the medical field, the image of Japanese people is hardworking, with integrity, meticulous, dedicated,
Lo cual obviamente me enorgullece, ¿no?
which makes me feel proud.
Y mi verdadero, en realidad, acercamiento a la cultura japonesa fue en el año 2015,
My deeper connection with Japanese culture began in 2015,
donde tuve la posibilidad de ir a partir de una beca al conocer el lugar donde nacieron mis abuelos.
when I had the opportunity to receive a grant to go get to know the land of my grandparents, Okinawa.
La municipalidad donde nacieron mis abuelos da becas a los nietos o bisnietos para que conozcan el lugar donde nacieron sus abuelos.
The municipality where my grandfather was born offered this opportunity for those grandchildren to go home and visit their ancestral hometown.
Ahí tuve la posibilidad de aprender caligrafía, shodo, odori, taiko.
So I had the opportunity to learn shodo, odori, and taiko
Y también obviamente donde habían nacido mis abuelos, ¿no? El lugar.
in the same place where my grandparents were born.
Ahí mismo conocí a una mujer empresaria que también había nacido en el lugar de mis abuelos.
There I also met a businesswoman who was from the same town where my grandparents were born.
Y entre charla y charla, ella me contó que era una empresaria y le conté, ¿no?, que una de mis pasiones era el canto, la composición musical.
So between our conversations, I shared with her my passion for songwriting, and I showed her some of my songs.
Y le mostré algunas de mis canciones y le gustó y me propuso producirme.
So she liked some of the songs that I showed her, and she offered to become my producer.
Bueno, gracias a ella, a partir de 2015, me generó tours tanto en Okinawa como en Tokio, ¿no?
So thanks to her, since 2015, it gave me the opportunity to go on tour in Japan and in Okinawa.
Una de las canciones que me abrió muchas puertas fue la canción que justamente le escribí a mis abuelos.
So one of the songs that was the most important is one that I actually wrote about my grandparents.
La canción se llama Entre Claveles.
The song is called Entre Claveles, or Between Carnations.
Y mi productora, la empresaria, hizo la versión en japonés.
My producer, that businesswoman, she created the version in Japanese.
Ella tuvo, a partir de su trabajo, pudo lograr que yo cante en un festival que se hace cada 5 años en Okinawa. Se llama el Uchinanchu Taikai.
So with her help, I was able to perform the song at a festival in Okinawa called Uchinanchu Taikai.
En este festival reúne, digamos, a los okinawenses del mundo en Okinawa y se celebran 3-4 días, se hacen muchos eventos, ¿no? Ahí adentro.
So this is a festival that brings together Okinawans from all over the world in Okinawa.
Entonces ella me planteó la necesidad de que yo piense de qué manera presentar la canción.
So she kind of made me think about what way I would present that song at the festival.
Y entonces estuve pensando, ¿no?, de qué manera poder mostrar la canción sin que sea tan abrupta, ¿no?, desde un principio cantar. Entonces se me ocurrió que podría generar una introducción, un preámbulo entre mi abuelo y yo, teniendo un diálogo con él.
So I was thinking about how I could present the song without having it start so abruptly, and I came up with the idea of preparing a video before I began the song that would show a conversation between my grandfather and me.
Y así fue como la presenté en el Uchinanchu Taikai y posteriormente en diferentes países.
And this is the video that I played in Uchinanchu Taikai and in a few other places, and I think we're about to show it right now.
Ahora quería mostrarles la parte de la introducción, no la parte cantada porque eso lo vamos a ver después en la recepción, pero sí la introducción de la canción entre el diálogo, ¿no?
So we're going to show you that introduction right now. We're not going to show the song right now because I'm going to perform it later tonight at the reception.
네, 어디? 僕はアルゼンチン生まれなのに、なんで僕の顔はこの国の人の顔と違うの？
グース、僕たちは日本人なんだよ。
僕、日本人なの？アルゼンチンに住んでいるのに？
そうさ、おじいは17歳の時、おばあと一緒に、3ヶ月も船に乗ってここへやってきたんだよ。
3ヶ月？日本って遠い国なんだね。でもおじいたちはどうしてアルゼンチンに来たの？
はるか昔沖縄はとても貧しかった。でも南米は仕事がたくさんあってお金儲けができるって聞いたんだよ。おじいたちはよ、南米に新しい生活を夢見てやってきたんだ。沖縄に残した家族を幸せにしてあげようと思ってね。
アルゼンチンでどうやって暮らしたの？
そりゃ大変だったさ。お金もない、スペイン語も話せない。だから朝から晩まで一生懸命カーネーションを育てたんだ。たくさんの一世はそうやって花を育てて生きてきた。うちのアンチはそうだな、働き者だったよ。
そっか。今僕たちが普通に暮らせるのもおじいたちのおかげなんだね。ねえおじい、夢は叶えられたの？
もちろんここでたくさんの家族ができて、おじいは一平幸せやいびんど。グース、アルゼンチン国籍であっても体に流れる血はうちのアンチだよ。
Bueno, para ir terminando, esta canción me dio muchísimas satisfacciones, porque no solo, si bien yo la compuse para mis abuelos, mucha gente se vio reflejada, ¿no?, en la canción. Así que, bueno, sin más, saludo, muchas gracias a todos.
This song gave me so much satisfaction because I really wrote it for my grandparents, but I was able to show it all over the world, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Gus. What you talked about, the carnation growing, that's something I think many of us in Southern California and also Northern California resonate with, because at one time there were many Japanese American flower growers. And just remember his name, Gus Hokama. You can look him up on YouTube. And I believe also that film is also maybe on YouTube as well. Okay, but we're gonna see it later on tonight. So next I will introduce Harumi López Higa. And she's a Peruvian film director and visual artist with, again, Okinawan roots. She's a founding member of NUNA, the Association of Film Directors of Peru, a researcher at the Peruvian Japanese Academic Association, and recipient of the Nippon Foundation Nikkei Scholarship Association grant. Her work includes short films, video installations, and participatory exhibitions. Harumi's artistic and academic practice explores themes of migration, memory, and minorities. Currently, she's pursuing a master's degree at Kyoto University. So, Harumi-san.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias a Discover Nikkei por organizar este increíble evento, y a todos ustedes los que están aquí en persona y también a quienes nos están escuchando y viendo en otros países.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Discover Nikkei and for everyone who's watching today here in person as well as on Zoom.
Mi nombre es Harumi López Higa, soy peruana Uchinanchu, y algo que tienen que saber sobre mí es que me encantan los rompecabezas.
My name is Harumi López Higa. I'm a Peruvian Uchinanchu, and something that you have to know about me is that I love jigsaw puzzles.
Me parece fascinante cómo una pieza por sí sola puede no entenderse, pero cuando se une con otra, crean sentido y construyen una imagen.
It's fascinating to me how a single piece by itself can't be understood, but by putting it together with other pieces, it creates an understanding and it makes a whole image.
Sin embargo, así como hay una gran satisfacción cuando puedes ver todas las piezas del rompecabezas, también puede ser frustrante cuando estás a punto de terminarlo y te das cuenta que te falta una pieza.
However, just like it's so satisfying when two pieces are joined together, it can also be very frustrating when you're about to finish the jigsaw puzzle and you know you're missing a piece.
A veces solo es necesario buscar en la habitación en donde estuviste armando el rompecabezas, pero otras veces resulta que la pieza nunca estuvo en la caja.
Sometimes all you have to do is look around the room where you're putting together a puzzle, but other times it turns out that the piece never came inside the box.
Otra cosa que tienen que saber sobre mí es que crecí en un hogar conformado por 5 personas. Mi mamá, mi papá, mis abuelos paternos, mi oji, oba y yo.
One other thing that you should know about me is that I grew up in a household of 5 people. My dad, my mom, my maternal grandparents, oji and oba, and me.
Cuando tenía 10 años, mi oba falleció. Y al poco tiempo, mi oji también. En ese momento sentí que en menos de un año perdí 2 piezas claves del rompecabezas de mi infancia feliz.
When I was 10 years old, my oba passed away, and some months later, my oji did as well. At that moment, I felt that in less than a year, I had lost 2 key pieces from the jigsaw puzzle of my happy childhood.
A los 12 años, a través del curso de historia, aprendí sobre la inmigración okinawense y japonesa al Perú.
At the age of 12, it was through a history class that I learned about the Japanese and Okinawan immigration to Peru.
En ese momento supe que mi familia materna, al igual que la de muchos de mis compañeros del colegio Nikkei en el que estaba estudiando, provenían de un remoto archipiélago.
It was in that moment that I learned that my maternal family, just like many of my classmates at the Nikkei school where I studied, came from a remote archipelago.
Y ese descubrimiento despertó mi curiosidad por querer saber más al respecto.
And this discovery sparked my curiosity to learn more about this.
Fue así que desde esa edad empecé a recolectar historias orales, fotografías e incluso objetos que me hacían imaginar la vida de mis ancestros.
From that age on, I started to gather stories, photographs, even objects which made me imagine a past that brought me to where I am now.
No fue hasta el año 2019, cuando gracias a un proyecto llamado Salón de Arte Joven Nikkei, que cada año convoca artistas para reflexionar sobre su identidad y expresarla en una exposición colectiva, que encontré un espacio seguro para sacar todos esos fragmentos que había estado recolectando.
It wasn't until 2019, thanks to a project called the Third Hall of Nikkei Youth Art, that every year summons artists together to reflect on their identity and express it in a collective exhibition, that I found a safe space to show all these fragments which I had been gathering.
Al ver atentamente estas piezas, pude ver un hilo conductor. Y es que en el caso de mi familia, fueron las mujeres quienes tomaron decisiones que abrieron caminos para las futuras generaciones.
When I was looking over these pieces closely, I could clearly see a common thread. In my family's case, it was the women who had made the decisions that opened up new paths for the future generations.
De esta manera, mi bisabuela, mi oba y mi mamá se convirtieron en las piezas angulares, en las esquinas de rompecabezas que estaba empezando a reconstruir.
It was in this way that my great-grandmother, my oba, and my mom became the cornerstones or the corner pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that I was starting to put together.
Así fue como nació la videoinstalación de Yonsei,
This was how my video installation Yonsei was born.
que si gustan podremos ver todos juntos al final del panel de discusión.
At the end of the panel discussion, we'll be screening the video so that you can all watch it.
Durante la cuarentena empecé a compartir la versión cinematográfica de Yonsei en diversos espacios en línea.
During the quarantine, I began sharing the short film Yonsei in several different online spaces.
Y en 2021 fui contactada por la Asociación Okinawense de América, en lo que sería la primera proyección de Yonsei con subtítulos en inglés.
And in 2021, I was contacted by the Okinawa Association of America for what would be the first projection of Yonsei with English subtitles.
Lo que nunca imaginaría es que un documental que trata sobre mi familia me permitiría conocer la existencia de una numerosa familia en Estados Unidos, descendencia de la hermana de mi bisabuelo.
What I never imagined was that a documentary about my family would allow me to learn about the existence of numerous family members in the United States, descendants of my great-grandfather's sister.
Ese día, a través de una reunión de Zoom, encontré piezas que no sabía que existían, pero que encajaron a la perfección.
That day, by way of a Zoom meeting, I found pieces that I had never known existed but fit perfectly.
Gran parte de mi familia emigró a Japón antes de que yo naciese, en lo que se conoce como el fenómeno de Kasei.
A large part of my family emigrated back to Japan before I was born in what's known as the Dekasegi phenomenon.
Si bien ellos ya eran parte del rompecabezas, sus vidas eran una imagen difusa para mí, que se ha vuelto más nítida desde que vivo en Japón y he podido compartir muchos momentos junto a ellos.
Even though they were already part of the jigsaw puzzle, their lives were like a very vague image to me, which has become clearer now that I've been living in Japan and I've been able to share more moments with them.
En todos los rompecabezas que he armado a lo largo de mi vida, la imagen de la caja siempre me ayuda a saber cómo debería verse el resultado final.
Every jigsaw that I've ever put together in my life has an image on the box that helps me know what the final result should look like.
Pero en este caso, no existe una imagen fija de cómo debe verse una familia.
But in this case, there's no fixed image of how a family should look.
Y creo que eso es lo más emocionante, seguir encontrando piezas en diversos lugares y dejarnos sorprender por lo que se nos va a revelar.
And I think that's the most exciting part, to keep on finding pieces in different places and being surprised by what's revealed.
Al inicio dije que cuando tenía 10 años perdí 2 piezas claves.
At the beginning, I said that when I was 10 years old, I lost 2 key pieces of the puzzle.
Pero la verdad es que las vidas de mi oji y de mi oba solamente se transformaron.
But the truth is that my oji and oba's lives have only been transformed.
Y es maravilloso ser testigo de cómo cada uno de sus descendientes llevamos un pedacito de ellos con nosotros.
And it's marvelous to see how each and every one of us, their descendants, carries a piece of them with us.
Y que puedo sentir en cada abrazo que me brinda, incluso si es virtual.
And I can feel that with every hug received, even if it's virtual.
Thank you.
Well, we can certainly see your skills as a storyteller, Harumi, and I can't wait to watch your film. And it turns out that I know one of her relatives that's here in Los Angeles that she'll be meeting in person, I think on Sunday, tomorrow, right? Okay, so now we have our last speaker, Jorge Okubaro. He's a Brazilian journalist, writer, and editor. He's written for national Brazilian media outlets about politics and the economy. His works include books about his father's personal history and the Japanese immigration in Brazil. But we also learned last night that George was actually jailed for 2 months in 1971 for his journalistic work challenging the Brazilian dictatorship. So he's obviously has a lot to share. He has researched Japanese immigration to Brazil under the auspices of the Brazilian Association of Japanese Culture, also known as Bunkyo, and serves as the president of the Sao Paulo Nippon Brazilian Studies Center called Jinmonken. So please, George, and we're really so lucky to have Marjorie, who could also speak Portuguese as well as Spanish.
Boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos. Inicialmente quero agradecer do mais profundo do meu coração a generosa possibilidade que a Jamie propiciou de vir aqui a Los Angeles para compartilhar esse momento muito importante para a reconstituição da história da imigração japonesa por todo o mundo.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to give a very deep thank you to everyone who made it possible for me to be here and share this story about Japanese migration to Brazil.
Esse menino tinha 13 anos e uns poucos meses de vida em 1918.
This boy was 13 years old and a few months in 1918.
Nunca tinha saído da aldeia em que nascera, em Okinawa.
He'd never left the village where he was born in Okinawa.
Esse menino emigrou para o Brasil.
This boy emigrated to Brazil.
E nunca mais voltou à sua terra natal.
And he never returned to his homeland.
Mais tarde, envolveu-se em um episódio que marcou a história da imigração japonesa no Brasil.
Later, he became involved in an episode that marked the history of Japanese immigration to Brazil.
Por recato ou pudor, esses fatos continuam misteriosos para muita gente.
Whether it was because of shame or modesty, these facts remain mysterious to many people.
Eles ocorreram logo depois do fim da Segunda Guerra Mundial e ficou conhecido como o caso da Shindo-Renmei.
They happened shortly after the end of World War II and became known as the Shindo-Renmei case.
É o nome de um grupo formado por fanáticos nacionalistas japoneses que não admitiam a derrota do Japão.
This is the name of a group formed by fanatical Japanese nationalists who did not admit Japan's defeat after the war.
Significa Liga do Caminho dos Súditos.
It means League of the Path of Subjects.
A comunidade japonesa no Brasil ficou dividida.
The Japanese community in Brazil was divided.
Os que diziam ter o Japão vencido a guerra ficaram conhecidos como vitoristas ou kachigumi.
Those who claimed that Japan had won the war became known as victorists or kachigumi.
Chamavam os demais de derrotistas ou makegumi.
They called the others defeatists or makegumi.
E os acusavam de traidores ou maus patriotas.
And they accused them of being traitors or bad patriots.
Houve muita violência.
There was a lot of violence.
Durante o período de atuação da Shindo-Renmei, 23 pessoas foram assassinadas e 147 ficaram feridas em atentados.
During the period of operation of Shindo-Renmei, 23 people were murdered and 147 were injured in attacks.
Cerca de 1.000 japoneses foram presos ou interrogados pela polícia.
About 1,000 Japanese were arrested or interrogated by the police.
Cerca de 400 deles tornaram-se réus.
About 400 of them became defendants.
Alguns tiveram sua expulsão decretada, mas não cumprida.
Some of them had their expulsion ordered, but it was never carried out.
Outros estavam sujeitos a penas de prisão.
Others had to carry out prison sentences.
Entre os presos estava um menino.
Among those arrested was the boy in the photo.
Seu nome é Masateru Okubaro. Ele é meu pai.
His name is Masateru Okubaro, and he is my father.
Este é o lado mais sombrio da história da imigração japonesa no Brasil.
This is the darkest side of the history of Japanese immigration to Brazil.
Se não levarmos em conta a cultura dos imigrantes japoneses,
If we don't take into account the culture of Japanese immigrants,
se não colocarmos esses fatos no contexto da história do Brasil,
if we don't place these facts in the context of Brazilian history,
ficaremos com a impressão de que os japoneses eram incapazes de compreender os acontecimentos e estavam dispostos a praticar as coisas mais horrendas que a espécie humana é capaz de conceber.
we'll be left with the impression that the Japanese were incapable of understanding events and were willing to do the most horrifying things that the human species can conceive of.
Em fevereiro de 2001, Publiquei a resenha de um livro sobre o assunto e dei a essa resenha o título Os Anônimos da Shindo Renmei.
In February 2001, I published a review about a book on the subject, and I gave the review the title The Anonymous of Shindo Renmei.
A polícia dizia que até 80% dos imigrantes apoiavam essa organização.
The police said that up to 80% of immigrants supported this organization.
A maioria dos integrantes eram pessoas comuns.
Most of the members were ordinary people.
Por suas crenças arraigadas, por sua formação escolar, por seus hábitos, pelos valores éticos, um imigrante anônimo como meu pai não poderia pensar de maneira diferente no fim do grande conflito mundial.
Because of his deep-rooted beliefs, his educational background, his habits, his ethical values, an anonymous immigrant like my father couldn't think differently about the end of this enormous world conflict.
Ao pesquisar o caso da Shindo Renmei, descobri um material muito rico, a história da imigração japonesa no Brasil.
When I was researching the case of Shindo Renmei, I discovered very rich material about the history of Japanese immigration to Brazil.
Para contar essa história, usei a vida de Massateiro como uma espécie de fio condutor da narrativa.
To tell this story, I used Masateru's life as a kind of guiding thread for the narrative.
Além da bibliografia disponível, consultei também fontes primárias, como os prontuários dos réus do processo da Shindo Renmei.
In addition to the available bibliography, I also consulted primary sources like the medical records of the defendants in the Shindo Renmei case.
Aí está a ficha policial, a identificação do meu pai no Departamento de Ordem Política e Social, o DOPS. No Brasil havia polícia política.
That's the police record, my father's identification with the Department of Political and Social Order, or DOPS. In Brazil, they were the political police.
Nesse livro, descrevo um homem comum, com virtudes e defeitos, formado na era Meiji, como um súdito do Império Japonês. Daí o título, O Súdito.
In this book, I describe an ordinary man with virtues and defects, trained in the Meiji era as a subject of the Japanese Empire, hence the title of the book, O Sujito, or The Subject.
Trouxe para o livro o cotidiano.
I brought everyday life into the book.
O afiar da navalha para barbear.
The sharpening of a razor to shave.
O sacrifício do porco para uma festa.
The sacrificing of a pig for a party.
A preparação de uma sopa de cabrito.
Preparing goat soup.
A educação rigorosa dos filhos.
Rigorous education of the children.
Os momentos raros de prazer e felicidade.
The rare moments of pleasure and happiness.
A dura tarefa de colher com as mãos o fruto do cafeeiro.
The hard work of harvesting coffee fruit by hand.
A geada.
Frost.
A malária.
Malaria.
A difteria.
Diphtheria.
A morte.
Death.
A vida.
Life.
Na segunda metade do século XIX, o Brasil precisava de mão de obra estrangeira para substituir o trabalho escravo nas fazendas de café.
In the second half of the 19th century, Brazil needed foreign labor to replace slave labor on coffee farms.
As relações diplomáticas entre o Brasil e o Japão foram estabelecidas em 1895.
Diplomatic relations between Brazil and Japan were established in 1895.
A primeira leva de imigrantes japoneses chegou ao Brasil no dia 18 de junho de 1908, a bordo do Kasatomaru.
The first wave of Japanese immigrants arrived in Brazil on June 18, 1908, aboard the Kasato Maru.
Eram 781 japoneses.
They were 781 Japanese people.
Deixar a terra natal é decisão difícil.
It's a hard decision to leave your homeland.
Reapresento a foto do menino Massateiro.
I bring back the photo of the boy Masateru.
É expressiva.
It's expressive.
O olhar parece focar um ponto distante, perdido.
It seems like his gaze is focused on a distant, lost point.
O olhar parece perdido.
His look appears lost.
Há uma certa tristeza no rosto,
There's a certain sadness on his face.
mas há também um certo estranhamento.
But there's also a certain strangeness.
Estranhamento é uma das marcas da vida de quem emigra.
Estrangement is one of the hallmarks of the lives of people who emigrate.
Talvez seja a primeira das cicatrizes que marcam a vida dessas pessoas.
It may be one of the first scars that marks these people's lives.
É duradoura,
It's lasting.
deixa dores,
It leaves pain,
lembranças que nunca se apagarão.
memories that will never be erased.
Os japoneses encontraram no Brasil um país estranho,
The Japanese found in Brazil a strange country,
uma língua estranha,
a strange language,
uma comida estranha,
a strange food,
uma gente estranha,
a strange people,
um trabalho estranho,
a strange job,
uma vida estranha.
a strange life.
Para quê?
Why?
Por um sonho,
For a dream.
sonho de uma vida melhor, de riqueza,
Dream of a better life, of wealth.
o sonho de vencer na vida.
The dream of winning in life.
A realidade, porém, é implacável.
Reality, however, is relentless.
Veja o caso dos passageiros da viagem que esse navio.
Take the,
Yeah, please.
take the case of the passengers on that trip in this ship.
Essa viagem começou em 25 de abril de 1918 no porto de Kobe.
The voyage began on April 25th, 1918, in the port of Kobe.
O nome desse navio é Wakasamaru.
The name of the ship is Wakasa Maru.
Esses viajantes se acomodavam como podiam.
The travelers accommodated themselves as best as they could.
Tinham direito a um espaço ínfimo.
They had the right to a tiny space.
Banho era limitado.
Bathing was limited.
Comida era o suficiente para mantê-los saudáveis até o destino.
Food was just enough to stay healthy until they arrived at their destination.
Nessa viagem, ocorreu uma epidemia de meningite que matou cerca de 60 passageiros.
On the trip, there was a meningitis outbreak which killed around 60 passengers.
O navio ficou retido no porto de Singapura em quarentena por quase um mês.
The ship was detained in the port of Singapore for almost a month under quarantine.
Massateiro estava nessa viagem, estava nesse navio.
Masatero was on that trip, on that ship.
Viera com o tio Taru e a tia Ushi.
He came with his uncle Taru and his aunt Ushi.
A vida na fazenda de café será melhor, tentava animar-se.
He tried to cheer himself up by saying that life on the coffee farm would be better.
Ouvira dizer que colher café era quase como colher dinheiro com as mãos.
He said, I heard that collecting coffee was almost like collecting money with your hands.
Trabalhar na colheita de café nunca foi tarefa simples.
Working on a coffee harvest was never a simple task.
Na foto, vocês podem ver imigrantes japoneses numa fazenda de café.
In this photo, you can see Japanese immigrants working on a coffee farm.
A produção raras vezes era parecida com a que anunciavam os cartazes.
The production was very rarely similar to what the posters advertised.
No caso de Massateiro e seus tios, a situação foi particularmente ruim.
In the case of Masateru and his uncles, the situation was especially bad.
Quando eles chegaram para trabalhar na fazenda de São Martinho, no estado de São Paulo, em julho de 1918,
When they arrived to work at Fazenda São Martinho in the state of São Paulo in July 1918,
não fazia ainda um mês que ocorrera uma severa geada.
it was only a month since a very severe frost had happened.
Muitos anos depois, meteorologistas confirmaram que aquela foi a pior geada da história, com os termômetros baixando para 2 graus negativos, uma raridade.
Many years later, meteorologists confirmed that that was the worst frost in the history of the place, with the temperature dropping to -2 Celsius.
O sentimento de frustração, tristeza, decepção, desencanto dessa gente
The feeling of frustration, sadness, disappointment, disenchantment of these people
está sintetizado de maneira notavelmente comovente nos dois haiku que estão na tela.
is synthesized in a very moving way in the two haiku that are on the screen.
Yu zareya kokage ni naite kohi mugi. Anoitecer, à sombra da árvore, choro colhendo café.
Nightfall, in the shade of the tree, I cry picking coffee.
Yo nigiseshi imin omoya kare no hoshi. Kare no hoshi. Penso no imigrante que fugiu, estrela-luz em prado seco.
I think about the immigrant who fled, starlight in a dry meadow.
Esses dois poemas são assinados por Hyokotsu.
These two poems are signed by Hyokotsu.
Era com esse nome que Shuhei Uetsuka, pioneiro da imigração japonesa no Brasil, assinava os seus haiku.
It was with this name that Shuhei Uetsuka, a pioneer of Japanese immigration to Brazil, signed his haiku.
As fugas da fazenda eram comuns e é isso que nos mostra o segundo haiku exibido na tela.
Escaping from the farms was common, and this is what the second haiku shown on the screen shows us.
No final dos anos 1920, o governo japonês construiu em Kobe uma hospedaria de emigrantes.
In the late 1920s, the Japanese government built an immigrant hostel in Kobe.
Lá, os emigrantes eram submetidos a exames exigidos pelas autoridades brasileiras.
There, immigrants were subjected to examinations that were required by the Brazilian authorities.
Este é o atestado de saúde da minha mãe, Fusako.
This is the health certificate of my mother, Fusako.
Por causa de sua formação e da brutal repressão que lhes impôs a ditadura que vigorou no Brasil de 1937 a 1945,
Because of their upbringing and the brutal repression imposed on them by the dictatorship that ruled in Brazil from 1937 to 1945,
muitos não conseguiram entender o que acontecia no mundo.
many people weren't able to understand what was happening in the world.
Transmissões em japonês não podiam ser captadas no Brasil.
Japanese language broadcasts were not allowed to be received in Brazil.
Publicações em japonês não podiam circular.
Publications in Japanese were not circulated.
Nem mesmo se podia falar japonês em ambiente público.
It wasn't even allowed to speak Japanese in a public setting.
Com o tempo, a maioria entendeu que era no Brasil que seus filhos viveriam.
Over time, the majority understood that their children would live in Brazil.
O processo de urbanização dos imigrantes japoneses se acelerou.
The urbanization process of Japanese immigrants accelerated.
Profissões urbanas como as de cabeleireiro,
Urban professions like hairdressing,
tintureiro,
dyeing,
quitandeiro
greengrocers
passaram a ser desempenhadas pelos imigrantes e suas famílias.
began to be performed by immigrants and their families.
Outros continuaram nas suas atividades agrícolas tradicionais.
Others continued their traditional agricultural activities.
Antes da guerra, já havia descendentes de japoneses formados na Universidade de São Paulo.
Before the war, there were already Japanese dependents who graduated from the University of São Paulo.
O número de Nisseis em curso superior cresceu exponencialmente a partir de 1946.
The number of Nisei in higher education grew exponentially starting in 1946.
Mas foi só na preparação das comemorações do 4º centenário de fundação da cidade de São Paulo
But it was only in preparation for the celebrations of the 4th centenary of the founding of São Paulo
em 1954
in 1954
que os japoneses se uniram para dar à cidade uma homenagem de valor histórico.
that the Japanese came together to give the city a tribute of historical value.
O pavilhão japonês no Parque do Ibirapuera, em São Paulo, é o resultado desse trabalho.
This Japanese pavilion in Ibirapuera Park in São Paulo is the result of this work.
É desse trabalho conjunto que nasce a Sociedade Brasileira de Cultura Japonesa e de Assistência Social, o Bunkyo, a mais representativa associação de nipo-brasileiros no país.
It was from this collective work that the Brazilian Society of Japanese Culture and Social Assistance, Bunkyo, was born, which is the most representative association of Japanese Brazilians in Brazil.
O Centro de Estudos Nipo-Brasileiros, São Paulo Jinmon Kagaku Kenkyujo, ou Jinmonken,
The Center for Japanese Brazilian Studies, São Paulo Jinmon Kagaku Kenkyujo, or Jinmonken,
é o fruto da preocupação de acadêmicos, pesquisadores, jornalistas, escritores e artistas com a situação da população nipo-brasileira.
is the result of the concern of academics, researchers, journalists, writers, and artists about the situation of the Japanese Brazilian population.
Sobretudo logo após o fim da Segunda Guerra Mundial.
More than anything after the end of the Second World War.
O centro tem se destacado como organização líder no seu campo de atuação.
The center stands out as a leading organization in its field.
É possível que, do ponto de vista material,
It's possible that from a material point of view,
muitos imigrantes japoneses não tenham alcançado êxito no Brasil.
many Japanese immigrants haven't achieved success in Brazil.
Mas não se mede o êxito apenas pelo resultado material.
But success is not only measured by material results.
Há uma herança mais importante que esses imigrantes deixaram.
There's a more important legacy that these immigrants left behind.
Trata-se do fato de que eles, em geral, conseguiram incutir na mente de seus filhos alguns valores duradouros e que determinaram a maneira de agir e de pensar desses filhos.
It's the fact that they managed to instill in the minds of their children lasting values that determine the way that their children act and think.
Há exceções, por certo.
Of course, there are exceptions.
Meu pai morreu sem deixar bens nem dívidas.
My father died without any assets or debts.
Nossa vida, minha família e de meus irmãos, foi a herança que meu pai deixou.
Our life, that of myself and my brothers, was the legacy that my father left.
Aí na foto está a família de Massateiro.
There in the photo is the Masateru family.
Essa foto é do fim de 1958, início de 1959.
This photo is from the end of 1958, beginning of 1959.
Aparecem meus pais, todos os meus irmãos e eu. Eu estou em pé, ali, o segundo da direita para a esquerda.
My parents, all of my siblings, and myself, and I'm standing second from the right.
Muito obrigado a todos. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
Thank you so much to everyone.
That was really beautiful. And I invite the panelists to now take their seats. And Marjorie, you're going to have to stand with me and translate when necessary. So right now, where did we travel? We traveled from Melbourne, Australia, to Granada, Colorado, to Hiroshima, to Peru, then we traveled to Argentina, and finally to Brazil. And it was just incredible to hear all of your stories. In the interest of time, I'm going to actually cut a lot of my questions, and I want you all, I bet you have questions. So if you are online, if you're on the Zoom, just put it on the chat. And for you all here, please have a question that more than one person can answer, so we can involve as much of the panelists as possible. But I want you to be thinking of the question. We'll be asking for it in a second. So for you all, I want to ask, what obstacles did you face in collecting your family story, and how did you resolve it? Does anyone need a translation?
So for me, since I had so much material, I mean, I was left with probably 4,000 photos and another 1,000 documents and stuff. But I can't read Japanese, and so I had incredible help from people like Emily Anderson and people that saw stuff on Discover Nikkei offered to help and stuff like that. And I think for obstacles, the biggest obstacle that I still have, so I have a bunch of letters, very personal letters since great-grandfather was a pastor, right, from like the 442 soldiers overseas that were his, that attended Gardena Valley Baptist Church and stuff. And I've tried to get the families, to share some of those letters that are incredibly valuable from historic sake, and they're so personal that the families do not ever want to see them released to the public. And you got to remember, some of these guys that volunteered from Amachi internment camp or Heart Mountain or Manzanar, they were disowned by their families because they volunteered while the families were there behind barbed wire, right? And so very difficult situation when you have documents and letters from families that they don't want to ever be seen in public and stuff like that.
You're nodding, Harumi. Yeah. And you can speak in Spanish if you like.
Ok, perfecto. Ayer pude conocer la historia de los otros panelistas y creo que a comparación de ellos mi nivel de investigación está recién iniciando.
Yesterday, I was able to meet the other panelists and, sorry, what was the second half?
Y a comparación de ellos, mi nivel de investigación es como muy inicial todavía.
And I felt like in comparison to them, my level of investigation was very in the initial stages.
Sin embargo, concuerdo con lo que dice Mitch con respecto al silencio.
However, I agree with Mitch with respect to silence.
Tanto en mi familia como en la comunidad en Perú hay mucho silencio porque parte de la historia es muy dolorosa.
As much in Peru as in my family, there is silence because the story can be very painful.
Así que el obstáculo fue el silencio que había en común, pero mi manera de poder enfrentarlo fue teniendo mucha sensibilidad.
So the obstacle was something that we had in common, but my way of confronting it was through sensitivity.
Ponerme en el zapato de mis familiares o de otros miembros de la comunidad y también saber y cuidarlos y qué historias se pueden contar y qué otras son mejor tenerlas en reserva.
Putting myself in the shoes of other people and thinking about which stories I wanted to share and which ones I wanted to keep personal.
I've been gathering information about my great-grandfather since I was a boy, in particular when I was a teenager. The major sources were my grandmother, the daughter-in-law of Setsutaro, who took care of him in his twilight years. She also lived in the same house as him. My father and some of my father's siblings provided me with a lot of information. There are also lots of documents, not on the magnitude of Mitch's situation. In fact, there's a scarcity. So putting the puzzle together, and I like Harumi's way of describing the jigsaw puzzle. And there are still some bits of the jigsaw puzzle that are missing. So it's been a labour of love over many years, but probably as I got older, there were some aspects of my great-grandfather's life that I started to be able to understand with greater clarity. And hence, there's now quite, I think, a comprehensive biography created by me. There are also many objects associated with his life. The vast majority I donated to the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, where there's currently an installation. And those objects followed me around the world while I was a businessman. But when I see them in that showcase, you can interpret objects. Objects tell stories. And I'm still working on my great-grandfather's story. There is a letter, or 2 letters written in the Kizushi script, which about 0.01% of the Japanese population can read these days. But there's a small team at the University of Sydney working on the main letter. And from what I can see, it might well be an uncle, the brother of his mother, scolding him for not returning to Japan. Anyway, I'll get more answers when they conclude their translation. They've been at it for several years now, and that might trigger me to make some adjustments to some of the things I've written.
How about Gus?
Obviamente yo no soy investigador, ¿no? Me dedico más a la parte de composición musical, ¿no?
Obviously, I'm not a researcher. I'm more involved with the musical composition.
Mi búsqueda más que nada tenía que ver con una búsqueda familiar y quizás enfocada más que nada a mis abuelos.
What I have to do has to do with the family side and more than anything, my grandparents.
Y quizás lo que más me llama la atención es conocer cómo sentían mis abuelos, cómo pensaban, ¿no?
What really grabs my attention is what my grandparents thought about and how they felt.
Y poder de alguna forma canalizarlo o capitalizarlo a través de la música.
And to be able to channel that in some way through music.
George.
Ok? Bem, escrever um livro é uma aventura ao mesmo tempo fascinante e temerária. Você nunca sabe que resultado isso vai ter.
Publishing a book is something fascinating and also scary because you never know what's going to happen.
E também quando você começa a pesquisar, você não sabe o que vai encontrar.
And at the same time, when you start researching, you never know what you're going to find.
Em alguns momentos, houve discussões internas na família. Publica isso ou não publica isso?
Sometimes I heard discussions among my family, publish this, don't publish that.
Minha família, embora não pareça, é uma família tradicional nos hábitos japoneses, sobretudo okinawanos.
It's a traditional family with Japanese values, above all Okinawan.
E o papel do Nichan, ou Nissan, é fundamental nas decisões domésticas.
And the role of Nissan is fundamental in the family.
O Nissan disse, publique. Tudo que você descobriu, publique.
In the public.
He said, yes, you have to publish it, to make it public. Então, publiquei o livro. Houve realmente surpresas. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, primeira surpresa quando você vê coisas que você não esperava. Episódios dramáticos que nós não conhecíamos. Ao longo da pesquisa, acabei vendo que eram realidade e estava documentado.
So, outra vez.
You discovered something you didn't.
Georgie speaks English. During the process of writing the book, I discovered things that I did not expect.
Yes. Publiquei, está no livro. Não
And I published it.
Então, essa é uma das experiências mais incríveis. E o segundo é o destino que uma obra tem. Eu escrevi meu livro porque achava que tinha que dar uma versão para aqueles fatos.
I wrote the book because I thought that I need to find a version of the facts.
Pesquisei, encontrei uma linha de interpretação daqueles fatos e publiquei.
I researched, I found a line through which to interpret the facts, and I published it.
E quando eu digo que o destino de livro é uma surpresa, às vezes o encanta, às vezes o decepciona.
And when I say that the book is a surprise, sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's disappointing.
Eu fiquei muito feliz quando o Harumi me mostrou uma foto de exemplar do meu livro aqui na Associação Okinawa Kenjin da Califórnia. Jamais esperaria por isso.
I was very excited about Harumi, and I learned that my book is in the Okinawan Association of America, which I never expected.
Muchas gracias, Harumi.
Thank you, Harumi.
Okay, can we have the team that's going to have the microphones for questions in the audience ready? I think there was. Let's see. Okay, so people, do we have a question or two? Right over there. And I may repeat the question for the translators. Okay.
This is mostly directed at our friends from Australia and our friend from Brazil. Was your family directly affected during the war? And did they receive the kind of treatment that by the government that was received by the Japanese in America?
Oh, wait, hold on one second.
Marjorie,
George,
can
did you understand? Okay.
No.
A pergunta é se a sua família recebeu o tratamento similar do que receberam nos Estados Unidos durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Entendeu?
Let me be the first to answer your question. So, Setsutaro Hasegawa was arrested on the day of Pearl Harbor. He'd had to register as an alien in early 1940, and he had to register at the local police station. So they knew exactly where he lived. Around lunchtime, a group of police arrived, they arrested him, and then he was handed over to the military authorities. He was then taken to the Tatura camp, which is about 2 hours north of Melbourne. It's farm country. The Tatura camp housed families and the men from the state of Victoria. It also housed internees from the Dutch East Indies, New Caledonia, New Zealand. Australia had become a hub, a regional hub of internment. He was released early on compassionate grounds and was subject to house arrest. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what your question is, but after World War II, in the United States, when people started to return to the West Coast and they settled back into life, started to rebuild their families and their economic situation slowly improved. Eventually, Japanese Americans fought for reparations and apologies, which I believe happened around 1988. In Australia, there are no reparations, there are no apologies. The community was so small, it didn't have a critical mass, and it was spread over a vast geographic expanse. We're not connected by the equivalent of the Japanese American Citizen League or other. So, and just let me give you some metrics on that. The community had shrunk to such a small number. So in the June 30th, 1947 census, the first census in 12 or 13 years, 335 people identified as being of Japanese origin or Japanese. 177 were mixed race. So they have a parent who is not Japanese. 158 identified as being 100% ethnically Japanese, but only 78 of them are Japanese nationals. And of those 78, there are only 8 women. And the atmosphere in post-war Australia was so oppressive if you were part Japanese or Japanese because of the return of the prisoners of war from the Japanese camps. I'm going to stop there because I'm talking too much.
Yeah, and I think your question was not only for the Brazilians, but the other Latin Americans. Is that correct? Well, anyway, I will have Harumi and Gus respond as well. But why don't, yes, George, why don't you respond to the question?
Ok, thank you. O Brasil rompeu relações diplomáticas com o Japão em janeiro de 1942.
Brazil broke diplomatic relations with Japan in 1942.
Foi mês e meio depois do ataque a Pearl Harbor.
It was a month and a half after the Pearl Harbor attack.
Foi numa reunião considerada chamada Conferência do Rio de Janeiro, que congregou os governos dos Estados Unidos e de todos os países da América.
There was a conference in Rio de Janeiro that brought together the government of the United States and all the countries in the Americas.
A presença japonesa no Brasil já estava sendo mal vista pela maioria da população brasileira, porque o Japão estava em guerra.
The point of view about Brazil, Japan in Brazil, the Japanese population in Brazil was already seen poorly because Japan was already at war.
O rompimento das relações diplomáticas entre o Brasil e o Japão trouxe mais dificuldades para os imigrantes japoneses.
And this breaking of diplomatic relations between Japan and Brazil brought even more difficulty for Japanese immigrants.
Já sendo mal vistos pela maioria da população brasileira, os japoneses ficaram sem uma representação formal do governo de seu país.
Since they were already seen poorly by the population of Brazil, now they didn't even have a representation by their government in the country.
Nos anos seguintes, os japoneses foram severamente reprimidos pela polícia.
The Japanese were very severely repressed by the police in the following years.
Seus atos, suas palavras, suas ações eram frequentemente vigiadas ou delatadas por vizinhos à polícia.
Their acts, their creation, their communities were basically watched closely by people around them and even reported by their neighbors.
Em 1943, cerca de 6.500 japoneses residentes na orla litorânea do estado de São Paulo foram removidos de lá.
In 1943, about 6,500 Japanese living in the coastal areas near São Paulo were removed.
Eles eram considerados potenciais espiões das forças inimigas do Brasil.
They were considered potential spies of the enemy forces of Brazil.
Essa repressão, somada à atitude da ditadura de Getúlio Vargas,
this attitude kind of summed up the repressive attitude of the Getúlio Vargas dictatorship.
foi tornando cada vez mais difícil a vida dos japoneses no Brasil nesse período.
So in this period, the life of Japanese people in Brazil was getting successively worse.
Logo após o fim da guerra, naqueles episódios que eu citei na minha palestra, muitos japoneses continuaram presos sob regimes que chamaria quase desumanos.
So around the time of the end of the war, as I discussed in my presentation, many Japanese people in Brazil were remaining under repressive regime.
A tortura era uma prática comum da polícia naquela época.
And in that era, torture was a common police practice.
No ano passado, em julho do ano passado, o governo brasileiro, por meio da Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos,
So in the past, the Brazilian government, through the Human Rights Commission,
tomou a decisão de pedir desculpas formais às famílias das pessoas que sofreram maus tratos e tiveram seus direitos humanos desrespeitados durante esse período.
so made the decision to ask for formal forgiveness for the repressive acts that they carried out. The Brazilian state, basically, the Brazilian state formally asked forgiveness for the repressive acts that they carried out during that period.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, because we want to see your film, Harumi-san, and Gus has to sing, and he's going to be showing his film. So, and you could ask any of these individuals at our reception, and there's going to be food there. So please engage them in conversation. So I think we'll probably wrap up with this particular program. And I do want to thank, so the people on Zoom, they actually had all access to the translators. And we want to thank Glenda de la Fuente, Marie Gratero, Marisa Shirasuna, Ciani Campos, Yoshiko Oyama, and Alberto Suzuki. This has been amazing to hear all your stories from around the world, and I think our world has expanded by listening to you all. So thank you very much for coming.